Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are joining us from. Welcome to day one of Alba Diversity Week 2023. Make sure to check out and register for the excellent events coming up this week. Thank you so much for joining today's event on day one. So I'm Isabel Castaño, one of the members of the Alba Disability and Accessibility Working Group. Just a brief overview of Alba, especially for those that don't know it very well, at least. You probably have heard of it, because you joined today. Mission or Alba's mission involves empowering brain scientists to be effective in diversity, equity, and inclusion advocates and allies. It really promotes the sharing of data and best practices, resources, recognizing outstanding contributions to science and diversity, and highlighting success stories, and offering better visibility and professional development opportunities to neuroscientists from underrepresented groups. So Mathilde actually just posted the website or the link for the today's week. So make sure to check that, and all the information that I'm showing here is on Alba's website. So very briefly, there's a wide variety of activities that are being organized as part of Alba across several working groups as well. So a few examples are the Alba Declaration, and the next slide I'll show you a bit more information on that. Webinars, including the series from what we're presenting today, so today's webinar, that I'll say a bit more about that in a few slides as well. And other things like there's a database of resources. So for example, on how to make a more inclusive work environment and workspace, from disabilities to gender or towards gender equity. So there's quite a lot of resources on the website. So I invite you to check it out. So regarding the Alba Declaration that I just mentioned, it is a resource for concrete, positive, evidence-based actions that individuals and organizations at any level can take to promote equity and inclusivity. So do please go to the website to sign the declaration. You can sign as an individual, you can sign as a laboratory group, a research group, you can sign as an institution. That's ideal, of course, but I do invite you to go and check out the declaration. And again, there's a lot of links there for resources. This slide is just to really thank our partners and supporters. You can see that Alba is getting involved with major organizations within neuroscience, which is very exciting. So as I mentioned, I'm part of the Alba Disability and Accessibility Working Group, and this is our group. We organize activities to raise awareness and increase the visibility of scientists with disabilities, encouraging best practices within institutions to ensure equal access to opportunities. And again, you can see a bit more about our group in Alba's website. Something quite exciting for us anyways is that we recently launched short videos where we share challenges and tips on how to make neuroscience more accessible to researchers with disabilities. You can find these videos across social media, such as Instagram, on YouTube. I invite you to do so, to share within your networks. And this was a very special project for us. So I do invite you to go check, and it's still ongoing. So there will be more upcoming videos. So stay tuned for that. So today's webinar is episode 3 of a series of webinars organized by our working group, by the Alba Disability and Accessibility Working Group. It's called Breaking Down the Ivory Tower, and this webinar series aims to bring down the ivory tower of ableism, one extraordinary neuroscientist at a time. It gives a platform to scientists with disabilities across the globe and neuroscience disciplines, while reflecting on how to promote inclusive working environments and accessibility in research workplaces. Today's episode is actually a very special one because Donna is also one of the members of our working group. You may have seen her introduce our group at the Alba General Assembly 2023. And on a side note, this is obviously if you attended the General Assembly, but if you have not, for future reference, all members can attend it and are in fact strongly encouraged to do so. So keep an eye on it for next year. And that's how I actually heard about this group. So it's a really, really nice event that I invite you to attend. So I'll give the microphone to Donna in a second, but just a brief bio. She will tell us more about her path. But Dr. Donna Rose Addis is a senior scientist at the Rotman Research Institute and a professor of psychology at University of Toronto. She combines neuroimaging, cognitive and neuropsychological methods to investigate how the human brain remembers the past, imagines the future, and constructs a coherent sense of self. As well as how these abilities differ with age, mood disorders, and memory loss. I personally find it very exciting. Dr. Addis' work has had a considerable impact on the field, with 115 publications and over 25,000 citations to date, and a number of prestigious early career awards. Donna, over to you.
Thank you so much, Isabel, for that introduction. I'll just share my screen. So it's a great pleasure and honor to be here today to talk to you all. So my research really started out on autobiographical memory, so how we remember our personal pasts and how we the brain regions that underpin this ability. But during the course of my career, there's been what could, I guess, be considered a transformation in how cognitive neuroscientists understand memory, with an increasing focus placed on the other side of the memory coin. So how we imagine our futures and ourselves in it. So I'm going to start out today, before I get into my research, telling you a bit more about my past and how I've gotten to where I am today. So I think I fit the definition of intersectionality. So this is something we talk a lot about in Alba. I'm from a mixed heritage background. So I'm part Samoan, and my family come from the Pacific Islands. So we're immigrants to New Zealand. I was raised by a single mother, and actually in one of the poorest neighborhoods in New Zealand. And with both of my parents leaving high school at 14, I was first in family for high school, let alone university. But I think one of the major influences, and continues to be major influence in my life, are the strong women that I had as role models over my life. Very hardworking women who weren't afraid to take chances to move country, to have a better life. And in particular, my mum, seen here, she has significant mental health disabilities and also physical disabilities. So she broke her back when I was a teenager at the factory that she worked at. So I got a lot of life skills from her with how to cope with different challenges. And so it probably comes as a surprise to many people, but I actually wasn't even planning on going to university. I was planning to just go work in a shop and then maybe eventually go to teacher training college. But then I won a scholarship on the basis, it wasn't something I applied for, I just got it as based on my performance on my final exams at high school. And that kind of made me think, well, maybe I could do this. So in line with my kind of goals to be a teacher, I started a Bachelor of Arts in history. But as soon as I took neuropsychology, I just was captivated and I changed my major to include psychology as well. At the same time of doing my undergrad, I actually also worked 30 hours a week to help support the family. And by the time I was in my undergraduate years, I had already been on psychiatric medications for a few years. So I was dealing with the side effects of that back in the 90s weren't really that well understood. And during my undergraduate, I developed a chronic pain disorder. So by the end of my bachelor's, I had such severe pain in my neck and my arms and my hands, I couldn't even hold a pen, which back then was kind of, we weren't really so much working on computers then. So that was kind of a big issue. And that kind of started, I guess, my lifelong relationship with the kind of medical health professionals, and also physios and chiropractors that, I still go to 3 times a week so that I can actually still do my job. So my world really opened up for me when I won a Commonwealth scholarship to Toronto to do my PhD. And then following that, I did a postdoctoral fellowship at Harvard. And this really, I guess, kind of highlighted to me the stresses that academic career, and also like moving away from family, kind of how this impacted on my conditions flaring up and things like that, and not having that family support from my mum and my grandmother. But I managed to find the right health professionals to support me. And I was really, really lucky to have just such supportive mentors, and as well as friends who became like my family, who have all been, very understanding and very, very supportive to me through difficult challenges. So after my postdoc, I landed a position back in New Zealand, which, in some ways, I think people at the time were like, I was sort of stepping off of this kind of Ivy League sort of track that I was on in some ways. But for me, it was really important because it took me away from the stress of a tenure track system and put me back with my family. And so it was a path that I could better cope with. But, even so, I managed to thrive there. And really just had, a fantastic lab and did very well. But then about 10 years ago, I had a major physical and mental breakdown, which took me many, many years to get over. And during that time, developed a rare autonomic disorder that affects my heart and causes severe fatigue as well. So in many ways, I'm so grateful then that I had the opportunity to come back to Canada for a research chair position. And although it was hard to leave my family again, it's given me great scientific opportunities, but it's also given me access to more specialized healthcare and even medications that I can't get in New Zealand for my heart condition. And really, if I want to keep working, I think, I do structure my life very carefully to be able to stay in this career that I love. And for me, actually being at a research institute rather than a university, without having all the kind of competing things of having to teach a full teaching load as well as doing research, being in this kind of environment has really helped me to do that. So I've now, shared a lot about my past, my autobiographical memories with you. And now I'm going to switch to talking about my research. And, I really got interested in this work because of, this amazing capacity that humans have to travel back in time. But we can also project ourselves into the future and imagine what could happen to us. And as I mentioned earlier, these abilities weren't really thought of as that connected. But in 2007, we saw the publication of 3 empirical papers that really kind of galvanized this close relationship between past and future thinking in the memory and in the neuroscience landscape. Looking at one study here, looking at amnesics, finding that they couldn't imagine novel experiences. And then 2 studies, including one from my postdoc, where we looked at the neural substrates that underpin these abilities. And it was pretty, I think, surprising, but also very interesting, fascinating to us that we saw just such similar neural correlates. Some of you who are in cognitive neuroscience will recognize this as the default mode network. And here we see it activated across the cortical midline structures when people are remembering experiences from their past relative to a lower level control condition, and also when they're imagining future events that they've never experienced before. And it wasn't a story of total overlap in the neural correlates, and something that was really fascinating to us was that the hippocampus, the anterior hippocampus, was more active when people imagined their futures relative to when they were remembering their past. And the hippocampus had, up until this point, I think, had really been traditionally thought of as a canonical structure for memory retrieval, particularly based on patients like HM who had such severe amnesia after damage to the hippocampus. So this really kind of took us on a new theoretical journey as well, to think about, well, why would we see this common activity between past and future? And so we interpreted this as what we called the constructive episodic simulation hypothesis. We were really coming from the perspective that episodic memory is a constructive process. And so that's why when we remember, we're really reactivating and reintegrating the details that comprise a memory, which are stored in a distributed fashion across the brain. And sometimes this leads to memory errors. And so it kind of begs the question, why would we have, such a, I guess, kind of error-prone system? Is that really adaptive? And so we argue that it is adaptive because it actually allows you to enable future simulation. So details that are stored in episodic memory are able to be reactivated, and then when imagining the future, we can recombine these details into novel combinations that underpin our ability to imagine the future. So in the 15 or more years since those initial papers, we've learned a lot about this process of imagination and how it relates to memory. So studies have shown that the default mode network is engaged by all kinds of autobiographical simulations. So this includes imagining the past or engaging in counterfactuals, like when we try to rework the past for how we could have done something differently so that we got a better outcome. We've found that the anterior hippocampus, we found that extra activity for that when people are imagining, and we've found that that really supports the imagination of very detailed events and kind of recombining those details to be very coherent, and also encoding the simulations that we make about the future. If they're to be of use to us, then we need to be able to actually remember what we planned out or what we troubleshooted when we then face that situation. We've found that creative cognition is related, maybe not surprisingly, to imagination, but it actually helps us imagine events more vividly. And we've shown that many populations with impairments, a range of differing degrees of impairment in memory, also show similar difficulties with future imagination. And this includes in older adults, individuals with mild cognitive impairment, individuals with Alzheimer's disease, with post-traumatic stress disorder. And as I'm going to tell you a bit more about today, we've focused a lot on looking at this in depression. So those of you who work in the area of depression might know that one of the most consistent cognitive deficits that we see in people with depression is a change to their memory function. And so people's autobiographical memories are what we call overgeneral. So this means that they lack in specificity. So to give an example, somebody might be asked to remember an event from their past, and they can give you a very specific occasion, maybe where, they went to, were supposed to be meeting with somebody and they didn't turn up, and, how that kind of unfolded. Whereas somebody with depression might be more likely to say something like, well, I'm always kind of left out. People always kind of, stand me up, like this happens all the time. And so it's this kind of very general information about things that are kind of repeated or abstracted from multiple experiences. So they're not able to, or less likely to tell you about something that's very specific in terms of its spatiotemporal context. This phenomenon is evident across the spectrum of depression. So it was first documented in individuals with suicidality. But since then, it's been seen in remitted depression, leading some to argue that this is actually kind of a trait marker of depression, as well as dysphoria. And there's some evidence that this overgenerality extends to the future, but or how people imagine their futures, which makes sense in many ways, given that depression is also, characterized by a hopelessness for the future. But really, when I came into looking at this, there was little known about, whether this was a reliable kind of effect, and about the mechanisms that might underpin these changes to future thinking. So there's contradictory findings in the literature. So some studies have found that there is an impairment in future thinking, others not. When we came to doing a meta-analysis, there had been one meta-analysis, but they only had 7 studies, and they documented a very large deficit in future thinking, but these were quite severe patient groups and quite a limited definition of looking at future thinking. So one of my graduate students, Bo Gamble, was really interested in this, and he took a broader view of depression and future thinking, so looking at the whole range of depression and looking at many different ways in which people test future thinking. And so we ended up with 52 samples with 4,800 individuals involved in those studies. And we did find a small effect. So you can see here, it's very small effect, but it was reliable across all of these different studies. And just to dig into this a little bit more, we actually then looked more into what were kind of the mediating or moderating factors. And we did find that this deficit was stronger when people with depression are trying to imagine future positive events. So that's really where we see this deficit coming out. So although our overall effect was small, it was actually double once you look at just positive events. And the other finding that we had there was actually that samples that contained more male participants, this effect was even stronger. So we haven't really looked into that further as to what that kind of interaction might be between sex and future thinking, but that's definitely something to follow up on. So another aspect of this then is to think about, well, what are the potential mechanisms that might be disrupting future thinking in depression? And at the time, or pretty much even still, I think the most focus is on psychological mechanisms, and this probably makes sense that people working with people with depression, it's clear that there's this ruminative or very overgeneral thinking style. There's also a cognitive avoidance. So if you learn that retrieving or thinking about very particular moments in your past is kind of psychologically disruptive, then you learn to avoid thinking about those memories, for instance, or potentially imagining things in the future. There had been some focus on neurocognitive mechanisms, so in particular executive functions. But I came to this, from my background in autobiographical memory and sort of knowing that that there are changes to the hippocampus in depression. So there's significant decreases in volume. So here's a healthy hippocampus and one from a patient who's had multiple episodes of depression. It gets worse with, the volume loss increases with the more episodes of depression somebody's had. And there's also evidence of reduced hippocampal neurogenesis, as well as deficits in what we think of as very hippocampally dependent forms of memory, so recollection, for instance, as well as reductions in activity in the hippocampus during these kinds of tasks. So in our first, or in one of our studies looking at this, trying to pit these different mechanisms against each other. First, we wanted to look at executive functions and look at some of the executive functions we know to be particularly important for episodic memory and to see if those showed an effect for future thinking. And so we had individuals with either a current depression or a history of depression, as well as never depressed individuals. And they did one of our behavioral tasks, which is where we give people a cue to think about their past or their future, and they have to describe a specific event. So we actually instruct them to try and think of something that's very specific in time and place. And then we look across all the trials, we get the proportion of events where they were actually able to think of something specific to talk about. And in this study, we actually had what would be considered in the literature very supportive memory cues. So in the sense that many studies just give you one word and you have to try and think of something, which puts a lot of demand on executive functions. Here we gave them potential examples of events that happen often to many people. So something like New Year's Eve or getting a new pet, that kind of thing. And then we included a neuropsychological battery, as well as psychological tests for rumination and avoidance, and like I said, executive functions. So what did we find? Well, we found that the depression group had a significant reduction in the proportion of specific events that they could generate relative to controls. Unlike other studies, we didn't find a difference for past events, but we think this is really related to those specific cues that we gave people, which, kind of shows the benefit then of how you're actually structuring something, structuring a task for people can really kind of ameliorate those deficits. We found, in terms of looking at executive functions, that it was the ability to strategically search for memory that was related to the proportion of future events that were specific. So that's something that is kind of narrowing down the kinds of executive functions that might be related to these kinds of autobiographical tasks. And interestingly, we found that rumination and avoidance were not significant predictors, and that this finding here, we got that as a significant predictor over and above those rumination and avoidance factors that we looked at. So then we also scanned these individuals using functional MRI. So they're doing the exact same task. They then were asked to rate how detailed their memories or imaginings were. And then after they come out of the scanner, we get a brief description from them so that we can restrict our analyses to only those events that they came up with that were specific in time and place. And so here we're really trying to control the behavior that we're comparing between control participants and depressed participants, basically to say, well, are there changes in how people are doing the task of actually generating a specific past or future event. And so what we found here was that, overall, we see that depression participants and the control group are activating largely similar networks. So seen here in the warm colors, we see activation across the default mode network. And you can see in control participants, the past and future tasks shown in warm colors engage these regions much more than the control task. And we see a similar effect in people with depression. But this isn't to say that it was the same everywhere. And we did actually find significant reductions of activity in the depressed group in regions like actually the anterior right hippocampus, which is what we'd found previously to be strongly associated with future thinking. So you can see here the activity in the control participants is much reduced in the depressed individuals. So then we actually looked at the connectivity of the hippocampus, and we found that while both groups showed significant connectivity to both the left and the right hippocampus while they were doing these tasks, we did find that the strength of this connectivity was very reduced in individuals with depression. So it was above zero, but it was literally about 50% reduction in the strength of the connectivity. Interestingly, though, people with depression engaged or showed connectivity from the right hippocampus to some areas or patterns of connectivity that the control participants didn't show while they were doing this task. So during the past condition, they showed increased connectivity to some particular aspects of the default mode network, including here the anterior lateral temporal lobe, which we know is involved in generating semantic or conceptual information. So they might be kind of fleshing out their events that they're thinking about with more conceptual content rather than episodic content. In the future condition, they actually engaged the central executive attention network. And so it really is suggestive then of compensatory activity or connectivity when people with depression are actually able to generate something that is specific in time and place. When they're thinking particularly about the future, they're engaging other networks that we don't see in the control participants. So just to wrap up then, I've given you this little introduction to some of the work that we've done looking at future thinking and autobiographical memory in depression. We've actually been doing more of that during the pandemic and really looking at the content of people's past and future thoughts and how those change with depression. But what I've told you about today is that, despite the focus on autobiographical memory in depression research, there is reliable evidence of a deficit in future thinking, particularly for positive events, which really fits with this idea of hopelessness being a really core feature of depression. Future thinking may actually be more impaired than memory. So, and even when we provide very supportive and structured cueing tasks for people, and it's likely that this reflects a higher load on executive functioning when you're having to generate or think of something from scratch. So it's easier to remember something that's actually happened to you before than to imagine something completely novel. We've found alterations of hippocampal activation and connectivity that contribute to some of the difficulties with memory and future thinking, but also compensatory patterns of connectivity that might help people with depression to imagine future events. And I think together this body of work and the work that other people are doing on this is really leading or has implications for new therapies. And there have been some new therapies that have come forth out of this kind of guided training to help people with depression really think about and imagine specific future events and hopefully to imagine a brighter future. So with that, I just want to thank my lab at Toronto and still have a few people at Auckland, my collaborators and my sources of funding, and also the Alba network in general, and the working group on disability and accessibility that I've been part of for the past year, which has been a really fantastic opportunity to be raising awareness. And just to give a shout out for Alba Diversity Week, it's continuing for the rest of the week. So there's events every day, including, given I'm from Oceania, really excited, but can't go because it's in the middle of the night for me. But there's a webinar tomorrow on diversity and inclusivity in neuroscience in Oceania. We have an event about global gender disparities in neuroscience on Wednesday. LGBTQ plus neuroscientists journey on Thursday, and addressing socioeconomic inequalities in neuroscience on Friday. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Donna. Wow. You find someone you work with inspiring until you hear their story, background in detail, and find that they're even more inspiring than you thought. Thank you so much. This was great. We do have some questions on the Q&A, and for others in the call, do please go ahead and ask your questions. I think I speak for Donna. It doesn't have to be necessarily just on the research. I actually have some of my questions are on your story. But so I'll start with, so Carmen Sandy on the Q&A asks, depression involves mood and motivational symptoms. Do you know if any of those domains is particularly related to the memory problems that you described in MDD? To what extent motivational deficits affect the information processing capacity?
Yeah, that's a really great question. We haven't done any work on this directly, but we did in one study that one of my PhD student Bo Gamble had done was to look at goal-directed future thinking in particular, to see whether there was a change there with people with depression, and just kind of more generally across, a large population sample. And what he found there was that there is, differences in the kind of approach and avoidance type of processing. So that kind of, broadly speaks to motivation. And there we found that people that had less of that kind of approach, sort of way of processing information, had poorer, or I guess less detailed imaginings of the future. And the other thing that we actually found was kind of, I guess, the reverse, that those who are able to imagine the future in much more detail actually are better at having achieved those goals that memory was about, that imagination was about 6 months later when we followed up with them. So that's kind of really interesting too. So it's definitely kind of a loop factor there, right? Like that your motivation or your sort of thoughts about goals and goal setting can influence the way in which you imagine, but then that can also lead to changes in achieving those goals. And, there is another line of work that looks at people who are better able to imagine the future in kind of detailed steps. So the steps that you need to make to achieve your goal actually do better at achieving those goals, versus if you just kind of imagine how you're going to feel once you achieve the goal. Like if you're going to feel relief or, happiness that you got an A on your exam or whatever. They actually did the study in people undergraduates studying for exams, and they found that they had to stop the study because the people that they just got to imagine how they'd feel after getting the A grade actually became more complacent and weren't studying and actually did poor on their exams, so they had to stop the study. So I think this shows the power of imagination in terms of actually achieving goals.
Fascinating. And before I move on to the next question, there's quite a few messages on congratulating you on the amazing talk and saying that you're very inspiring. So another question from Carmen: did you see differences in total brain activity between controls and depressed individuals?
Yeah, so we didn't look at kind of, I guess, overall, like kind of general brain activity, and we didn't look at anything like resting state connectivity or anything like that. We're really just looking at task related activity, but we did a whole brain analysis approach. So we used something called partial least squares that allows us to look at kind of whole brain patterns of activity, and really when people were doing those imagination and memory tasks, overall, the pattern of activity in the default mode network anyway was fairly similar between depressed and people with depression and controls. So it's not that people aren't able to do these tasks at all. And I think that's something really important to emphasize. It's not that people with depression can't think about their future. It's that there just might be subtle differences in the quality of how they're able to do it, or it might even be that it is more taxing to them to think about that. And I think, from my own experiences and experiences with, my mom, I think when you're in a major episode of depression, like there is not anything that you can really, you're just trying to survive, right? And you're just trying to do what you can do to get through the day to meet your minimal level of obligations that you have to do. So you don't lose your job, or you don't, completely sort of disintegrate your life. And so I think in those situations, then you're not necessarily able to take the kind of liberty or, that you have that cognitive capacity to spend your cognitive capacity on those kinds of things. And I think at the same time, you might be sort of, also dealing with kind of very, intrusive negative thoughts, particularly if you have anxiety. That's something that we see in the literature, is that while people with depression struggle to imagine the positive, people who have anxiety, or then maybe comorbid anxiety, it's hard to keep the negative future away. Like, that can become more intrusive and almost automatic. And so I think that's kind of a really, important difference too.
Yeah, thank you. And I was hearing you and imagining or thinking about knowing exactly what you were saying as someone that lives with anxiety and have a past history of depression as well. It's like your brain is using so much energy on that it's very difficult to even think about things in the present rather future. Thank you, Donna. Okay, so I also have to apologize to anyone that I'm reading their questions and pronouncing their names wrong. So apologies in advance. But Adnan Levent says, great talk, Donna. How did you choose the cued words? Were they positive or negative words? If you use both types of words, did you run analysis on positive and negative cued words separately? Very interesting question. If so, were there any differences within each group? For example, recall for positive words versus negative words and between groups.
Yeah, so this isn't something that we did in our particular study. We did check the valence of the reported valence of what people generated from our cues, and they were generally kind of neutral to mildly positive, although people with depression did rate them slightly less positive. But there's a whole body of literature that actually does this kind of task. So the task where I said people use single cue words to get people to think about their past or their future, usually getting people to remember events, they use single emotional words. So it might be embarrassed or happy or content. And they've compared then what people generate to, the kind of positive words, the negative words, or the neutral words. And excuse me, I think this is part of what comes out in our meta-analysis, that it's really the positive, when people are faced with one of these positive emotion words and they have to remember an event to do with that they tend to be less specific. So that's really where that finding comes from. But it was interesting in our the work that we did during COVID, we used a task where we give no cue really at all. We just give people these kind of beginnings of a sentence, something like last week I, or in the future I, and we let people finish them however they want. And that's kind of a way of us to then look at how specific people are. Do they kind of what's their general cognitive tendency when they're doing these kinds of tasks, doing these kind of thought. It's basically like just giving us a thought. And we found that actually people with depression were more specific, and particularly about the past. And so this was in the first year of COVID. And when we look at the content of what they're generating, it's more negative, but also more health related and COVID related. And so it was almost like a fixation on the negative about COVID. So I think that's kind of a really interesting result. So I think you can sometimes see more specific detail when it's about certain things. So I think that's kind of something the field has to, that we need to look at more.
Thank you, Donna. Okay, so now we have, again, lots of great positive feedback. A question from Caterina Miranda, also from our working group. Donna, thank you so much for your amazing talk and for your amazing work. Besides the disorders like depression that you mentioned, do you know if other non-psychological disorders can affect this past, remembering the past and future thinking? Like, for example, other neurodegenerative disorders, or even diseases that can lead to neuronal impairment as consequence, such as diabetes?
Yeah, so there has been work looking at other neurodegenerative disorders. So we did a study with some collaborators looking at people with semantic dementia. So trying to understand whether, the role that conceptual or semantic information might play in remembering and imagining. And these people don't show a deficit in remembering recent past events. However, they did show a significant deficit in imagining the future. And when they did imagine the future, they were usually taking something that had just happened to them recently and then imagining the exact same thing happening to them again. So that was their kind of strategy for doing the task. They might be like, well, I had a nice dinner last week with my daughter, so I'm going to do the exact same thing this week. So it's either kind of showing a less flexible thinking, or actually that I think it speaks to this idea that future thinking actually, it might be very similar to remembering, but it's actually executively more demanding in many ways. And maybe this also requires more sort of schematic knowledge to allow you to do that. And so other disorders that have kind of an executive component to it, such as Parkinson's disease, they also show a deficit mainly for future thinking versus remembering. Other kinds of, non-psychological or non kind of neural disorders, I'm not sure about, like whether disorders like just diabetes have an effect, but I'm sure that anything that kind of, impacts one's kind of level of inflammation in the brain might have some kind of disruption, although it might be very subtle, depending on the, degree of disruption.
Yeah, I would expect that too. Okay, so now we have a question from Italy Katak. I don't know if you want to take this one, but I actually worked with DNA methylation in my PhD, so I can add some comments, but I'll start with you, Donna. Do you think there will be any difference at the brain DNA methylation level in your study?
Yeah, that I do not know. I have no idea. I don't know, Isabel, if you have any thoughts about that. I really don't know much about
it. I haven't worked specifically on psychiatry or psychology. My area of expertise is Alzheimer's disease. I have worked in DNA methylation in Alzheimer's disease and in a group. So the group where I worked with which is based at University of Exeter, the epigenomics group. There was a lot of people there working on depression, schizophrenia. So there's there's a bunch of studies, especially epigenome-wide association studies and meta-analysis looking at differences in DNA methylation. So there's definitely changes there. And so, also in specific brain cells, yeah.
Right. So I guess there's definitely a potential for that to be the case, because we also, see disruptions in schizophrenia, like many different psychiatric and neuropsychological disorders have some degree of disruption in these abilities. So potentially, but it's a bit interesting thing to look at. So
Okay, so I think I went through all the questions on the chat. I have a few questions myself,
sure.
Also on your background, but you do answer on your research. You did already. I had a question about hopelessness, and you actually touched on that on your last slide. So I'll go with my other question on your research. I was thinking when you were presenting about the role of emotion. So how and what we remember regarding what we imagine for the future, because I know that you can have two people having the exact same experience or being in the exact same situation and remember it very differently depending on what types of emotions it generated. So I know that's, I guess, true for past events. Is that the case for also future thinking, you think, on your work?
Yeah, I think so. And I think if we kind of take the theoretical view that we use our details from our own episodic memories in order to imagine the future, and also maybe the schemas that we've learned about, like, here's how events usually unfold for me, that's kind of very influential information, right? That's going to kind of constrain maybe how you think about the future. And I noticed somebody mentioned something about, having depression and not feeling that they were very creative. And I think, this is part of, we know creativity plays a big role in how we imagine, but it's also reliant on, regions like the hippocampus and executive functions, and that these things can be, disrupted, or, that you have impairments in these abilities that then kind of constrain how able you are to think outside of the box of your own experience. And, I think this is actually just a general thing. I think, sometimes and this kind of speaks to equity and inclusivity, is that if you can only imagine, I think, mostly things that you sort of have some context for. And so I kind of think about like my own experience. I never ever could have imagined having the job, the career that I have now, when I think about myself as like a teenager. And I think it speaks to what my goals were. I wanted to, I thought, well, I'll work in a shop because I can't deal with the stress and the anxiety and stuff of going to university. No one I knew was going to university. It was kind of too big a thing for me to even think about. So I was like, maybe I'll be a teacher, because that was kind of what I had been exposed to, was high school teachers. That was kind of all I could see myself doing, because that's all I knew about. And then it wasn't until I went to university that then I saw, oh, you can actually be a researcher, or like you can be a university teacher, like you can be at that level. And so it was sort of really what I had been exposed to really kind of either constrained or opened up my world for what I could see as possible. And so I think that's also why, like, having kind of just people knowing more about the kinds of things you can do, particularly for primary school and high school kids, like, those kinds of community outreach interventions are actually really important, I think, for that reason.
I'm so glad you mentioned that about being exposed, and I guess even role models, because that's exactly one of the reasons we're doing these webinars. For me, it was growing up without a female role model in science anyway. So a lot of us have this, like, I don't think I have what it takes because I'm not seeing people like me doing it. So thank you so much for mentioning that. And on that, I mean, you can also mention challenges you had across your professional path, but I'm more interested in what were things that you found that were particularly helpful for you to thrive? And this can be actions from colleagues, actions at an institutional level, accommodations. What were things that you found very helpful?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. Like, I've always had, one or two really close mentors, almost basically friends, people that became friends to me, that, might have been 20 years ahead of me, that having that kind of just a person that I could kind of just even, sometimes it's really hard to even just make decisions. Sometimes, particularly if I'm very, in an episode or something, I can't make decisions. Like, that just becomes too much. And having somebody else that you can just run stuff by just helps to alleviate some of that kind of difficulty. And I think too, like, being open with, for me, like, I might not be open necessarily with everybody, or like go into the details of what's, of my conditions. But I've always told my immediate kind of supervisor or boss, so like the chair of my department in Auckland knew and was actually very instrumental. At one point, I just had to reach out and be like, I'm really, really not doing well. And he basically like stepped in and emailed every journal that I had owed a review to or was an editor for, and said she's stepping down or she's backing off, like, she can't do this right now. And having somebody else do that for me, so I didn't have to do it. Like, sometimes you just have to ask for help, as hard as it might be. And often, in my experience, most of the time, people have been really, really supportive and given me what I need. But sometimes it's really hard, right? Because you feel like you're always having to sort of, people forget, or, and it feels you don't want to let people down. And that's kind of part of, the thing of like, it all feeds into like, I'm just not coping and I can't do this. And, and I think for me, if I didn't have my mother always telling me like, you can do this, and like, she's like my number one cheerleader. And, at points in my career, there's been times where like, I just haven't even been able to, write a paper, because it's just so difficult, because my executive functions are just not, I can't integrate ideas and stuff. And it's just so hard, so easy to become hopeless and to think that this is how it's always going to be. But eventually eventually things it comes and goes, right? And there's ebbs and flows. And something that a colleague said to me once was that there's always ebbs and flows in your career, where there might be times where things are just not, you're not as productive, but it'll come back again at some point. And sometimes for me, that's been, you know, years of feeling like I'm just struggling and, you know, whatever, just really, you know, it's just been hard. And then it's kind of eased off again. And so it's just, as hard as it is, holding that hope that like things will come back around again.
Yeah, thank you. It's very brave of you also to disclose. I know how scary it can be, but it's great to hear that you've got a lot of support. So we have a few more questions coming in on the chat. So thank you for a fantastic talk. Does your own research sometimes help you during personal challenges? For instance, knowing this deficit of future thinking in depression remind you to reorient thoughts?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think sometimes, yeah, it does help. Sometimes I find it hard doing research on this because I feel like I identify too much. And, you know, this is part of why I never went into kind of psychological practice or anything, clinical psychology, because I found I identify too much. It's just too close for me. And so sometimes when I'm doing this and people are talking about, oh, people with depression, this and people with depression, that, and I'm like, yeah, but that's me, you know, and sometimes it's too close to home and then I find it a bit hard to deal with. But at other times, yeah, I do think it like kind of helps me understand, particularly like the kind of, you know, when I've had kind of struggles, you know, just coping with work, with the academic side of work and just like the thinking side of things, it's been helpful to know, to have an understanding that, oh yeah, that's because executive functions aren't working so well or whatever, or I can't remember stuff because I'm not encoding things properly. And I think sometimes that really does help. And it's actually helped my mum too, to kind of understand these things much better.
Yeah, thank you. We're very close to having to finish, but I do want to read a comment from Katerina just because it was on your earliest point. And I actually agree with her, but she says, I don't know if you agree with me. I just feel that I want people to understand that we can do it. We just need to have the resources, the conditions to get there. So the accommodations, I absolutely agree with her.
Exactly. And I think for me too, it has been that, you know, I do have to structure my life in certain ways. Like I can't work so much on the weekends anymore because I have to rest and I can't, you know, do certain kinds of, you know, it's harder for me to travel because I, you know, experience difficulties with the fatigue and the jet lag and all sorts of other kinds of things. And sometimes, yeah, the anxieties around these things. But I think, yeah, it's having support from others and having better understanding of how, you know, the conditions or the support that we need to get there, that then, yeah, we can do it. It's just in our own way, on our own time. And yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for everyone's also positive comments. Thank you for attending. I hope to see you on the next events throughout the week. Thank you, Donna, for a fantastic
Thank you so much.
presentation. And have a wonderful rest of your week, everyone. Bye.
Bye.